as the lecture, considering the lecture today, I will be focusing on this sort of square making, square creation from its sort of Western origin, which is also the background for the coming workshop. And I'm not so much showing my own work. I'm more focusing in the history and sort of what's happening now in the square making in the Nordic context, and about the different layers of this unique public urban space and these different layers and how it works as an interface between so many things in our public, as part of our public life. And the square in the making is sort of what why I choose the title. It's sort of connected to that that it's urban design is a continual process. It doesn't have the sort of the time when it's the right one, and it develops continuously. And squares have also been extremely resilient urban spaces throughout the history. And about the objectives of this lecture, I'm going to talk about that how the urban space is a process, about it like how they have endured, but also about the change, that how this kind of a change is part of that issue that makes them endure. And the perspective is very much socio-spatial perspective. How we act, how we deal, how we are in the spaces, and why they are so important. And that is also linked to the creation of civic space, how it creates a civic space. And reflecting these objectives, I have, like it was in the subtitle, I have 3 themes: time, space, and place. And in the time, I will be talking about the resilience and the adaptability of the squares, springing from the history onwards, and the creation and the design, how it has changed. And then also in the space is how the spatial form making is creating the functions, but also on the other hand, how the functions are affecting the square and the creation of the square. And then, of course, and the last one, and not the least one, is this question of placemaking and its social context. What is the concept of placemaking and why is it important? And I'm going to reflect a little bit also about the history, sort of the recent history of the placemaking. I start actually to sort of open up the concept of resilience. And resilience as a concept is, of course, it's linked to this endurance, that something can endure. It's not so much that is it a good or bad thing as when we think something is resilient, but as a concept it is emerging in this sustainability discussion, and also because of these connotations it has for change and adaptability. And it's almost starting to some extent replace sustainability because it's so holistic in its character. It's sort of changed from the worldview, from this mechanistic linear understanding how world operates, to this systemic understanding of the world, that how everything is connected, that by emphasizing certain issues, other issues might sort of go down, or that if something is only as a sort of just emerging, that how its possibility to emerge can be can be sort of killed in a way by not understanding its systemic understanding. And in resilience as a sort of a concept which is applied to socio-ecological systems, and which I'm doing also myself to space, it's the understanding that the system can endure through its capacity to change and adapt. So it is, in a way, in urban design, even urban design is always, there's a long-term view. It's also recognizing the issues that in the sustainability and this kind of a holistic understanding, we need to start to see things in a long-term view. And if you're interested in this, this is not the topic of the lecture at all, but I put this in a very interesting book which sort of talks about this, is the Resilience Thinking from Walker and Salt from 2006. But I'll start in the beginning, how in the Western society started to understand the creation of squares, and which is sort of in the background of all the sort of European square making and understanding square as a civic space. And usually the narrative where it started, it's put into Greek, ancient Greek, in agora, which was sort of developed or emerged in the 5th century before Christ. So it's very old in that context. Of course, there has been squares before that, but then the idea of the square as an interface, as a democratic space emerged. And it was a physical space layered from many things like daily religious, political, judicial, social and commercial activity. But it was a space where free men could talk and come together to discuss. Of course, the interpretation of this democracy, it was open only for men, and women and slaves were excluded. But the idea started there. So you can see the agora and the civic building around it. So if we go to the time and the endurance and these issues about what makes public space endure. And I put this, some of you probably recognize this is the sentence and book introduced by Kevin Lynch. What time is this place? It is the idea here that actually it is very different times. It's never, there is no issue in urban space that this is it and it will be like that for the coming thing. So it's continually evolving thing. And this resilience, it's of course, it's as the long-term view, it's the memory of the place, it's the meaning creation, it's the memory creates the meaning for us. We have all certain places in the city which are also personal memories for us, how we met our loved one, and or it can be even we have some bad memories of something in there, but it creates the meaning. But there's also this, it's a process. You can see the process of things happening, things changing and evolving. And that's also part of the meaning creation. So that adaptability and process is very much in the making here. But when we think about squares, it's also this very short term, the daily rhythms, how we walk through, how we go about our business. And there are always something that are fixed, like the routes we take depending on the design. And then there are these changing aspects that happen, events and other gatherings, which are very short term, but are a particularly important part of the squares and square making and this making of the civic urban space. And when we think about memory, I took here a couple of examples which I thought sort of epitomizes quite well how long and how the beginning of these squares have been emerged in the urban space. Like here, Piazza Navona in Rome, in Italy, which you can see here in the middle. It takes its form from a pre-existing Roman stadium, which is almost 2,000 years old. Of course, its present form, it is just like a memory, but its present form is from the 17th century. I put here sort of, this is a manipulated image I found in the internet about this stadium, how it looked like, how it was before the Rome became what it is now as an urban context. And you can still see that Piazza Navona is here, somehow embedded in the space, as you can see here in the axonometric of Piazza Navona. And it's interesting because since also in that aspect this square, because it's been like it is since the 17th century. But there is also another way of becoming a square. I took a sort of an example of a process and adaptation as another example, which is also very old, but it's a Grote Markt in Antwerp in Belgium. And it has had this incremental approach. It's here. It has been changing slowly, even though this is the historical city center. We have the town hall here, like the squares, old squares in Europe. They were either linked to the city halls or the sort of the cathedrals of important churches or some important buildings, but usually it was these civic buildings or religious buildings. But it became about in a slowly transformation from this medieval origins of the place. And here you can see the square, what it is now. And it's quite interesting because it has in its very near to it is this cathedral, which you saw the plan. And even though it's not the cathedral that is sort of giving the border for the square, but it's still visible that you can actually see the high tower of the cathedral in there. So it is there apparent in this square also. But then when we think about the daily rhythms, which are very important, it's the way we go about, it's the human scale, it's about the way we use or be in it, how we define ourselves in urban space. And I took this image of a granary square, King's Cross, which I think very well epitomizes the temporary time, how the issues change. Like it has these little fountains, which when they are at work and certain times and certain weathers, it's a totally different thing than when they are turned off as a square. And it has become, because it's very centrally located in the city, in the King's Cross, this reformed King's Cross area in London, it has sort of gained prominence in a way, the use of it, particularly in the hot summer days. and there it's bordering also the design school there. But it has also caused a lot of discussion in the society, because it's developed by the developers who are responsible for the area. And there's been a lot of discussion in London also, that is it a public or private square? What happens if people want to gather in a certain way, which is not pre-thought in the square? And I think it's a very interesting topic in a way, that what is a public square? Is it a civic square that makes the public square? As we know, squares are all of places of gathering. It's this discussion that is happening, like demonstrations in the square, the civicness of it, or the celebration. This is I think it's an interesting image when the Finns won the World Championship in ice hockey in Helsinki. This is totally self-organized happening in a way. We have been sort of the second in ice hockey, very often an underdog in ice hockey, but when we finally won it, people just came to the square, and it became sort of a flying sentence in a way. Let's meet at the square if something good, if something happens. And you can see the joy of the people, and it was totally packed. Then about the topic of the space, because when we think about squares and when we think about public space, somebody most likely have been instrumental in creating it, either design or slow process of creation. But there is a conscious effort to make the space, as we in architects and designers know. And when we think about urban design, this is also a book title, The Largest Art, but is it really the largest art? And should it be? And it is also, even though we don't purposely sort of instrumentalize it in that way that we want to be a piece of art, but it becomes an architectural formation always. And urban design is sort of considered as the largest art in that respect. But it's interesting because it's sort of, it has all the scales from the city to the tiniest detail. So I think it's extremely interesting in that way, that how we create urban spaces of this scale difference, what it has. And it is this kind of like, we give a form, with the form we give the possibility for function, but it also operates other way round. And I'm going to talk about that soon. But we sort of have this understanding very rooted in sort of based on the European urban design, that we have had this blueprint approach, that we have a drawing, and then we execute it, and then we have been thinking that this is it then. And it's the focus has been very artistic in that way, that we create a space. And of course, there have been ideological and promotional issues also in it. But we are actually changing a little bit that view in Europe, and then in this sort of a development of urban design is this strategic approach, that we can't really predict everything what happens. The planner can't know everything, and there are so many interesting things emerging. So it's more like setting the objectives and not defining the outcomes necessarily, so in a fixed way. Of course, there are always these fixed and changing aspects, as what I talked about just. And it's very important in a way to think when you do urban design, what needs to be fixed, what doesn't. What do we fix, what we don't fix. And I'll start first this sort of the history of European square creation, this artistic approach. And it's very sort of, there's this very seminal book that was written by Camillo Sitta in the end of the 19th century, The Art of Building Cities, which sort of consciously recognized these issues, that they are made for certain, they are sort of also aesthetic issues. The observation, how the people observe them, is very important. And there is an extract from the book, but he sort of talked about how he was promoting this sort of medieval approach for aesthetic urban design in that way that he sort of wanted to depart himself for this grid building, which is sort of the basis of many cities in Europe and beyond, of course. But it was the sort of the first time he sort of brought in the issue as an aesthetic observation from the viewpoint's eye level of the squares. And you can see this developed, this idea, a little bit further in Kevin Lynch's image of the city, this sort of a most iconic book already, a seminal book in 1960, The Image of the City, where Kevin Lynch took this sort of observation also as a mental space, that how people create mental maps. And Lynch sort of sees 5 ways that how these 5 elements create these mental maps. There's path, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. And how they are like landmarks, like I showed the image of the Grote Markt, where the landmark of the cathedral was shown into the square. So it also serves as an orientation in the city. And this Lynch book was very important around the world, but also in this sort of discussion about urban design and how we design cities. Ideological aspect is that, like modernism was amazing distraction in a way, the development of urban design and urbanity in general. And the modernist approach here, we have Le Corbusier's Contemporary City from the 1922, which tried to promote a new way of understanding of the city, and sort of didn't see any importance of the memory of the city. This was a plan for Paris, but it's also the understanding of the scale was enormous. I mean, Corbusier was fascinated about the big ships and the engineership and the cars, which were emerging then. They actually knew things and wanted to have the same kind of rationality which they epitomized. And this actually was so influential, these issues and ways, that we are still dealing with them in our societies. But of course, there's a lot of counter criticism coming against for this ideology and the way of designing urban design. And then I go to sort of this paradigm shift. Paradigm means the way of thinking of something, and shift, that when this thinking is changing a bit, which is happening at the moment. And I come to that history a little bit later on. But I think it's quite interesting is also how the short rhythms affect the long-term rhythms. This is alla Siepul fixed, nowadays fixed, or becoming sort of a fixed thing in the city, even though it was only designed as a temporary issue here in a place in the very city center near the harbor, where they have been trying to build here a hotel, a design museum and whatever, but it never went through. So they thought that they take it into use, temporary use. They even designed the building as a modular system that they can take it easily down. But people loved it so much that now they're discussing that to having that temporarily, permanently in the area. And it is this kind of a interesting aspect. Other kinds of interesting aspects like that are happening all over the Europe, in Finland, Nordic countries, and everywhere, that people are sort of rethinking what urban design is. Who is allowed to sort of affect the urban design is very much in the question and stake here. And I am going to show a couple of, I think, very interesting squares around Denmark, actually. Most of them are in Copenhagen, because I think there's so many interesting issues happening there about the square and how they are developed. And of course, they are always linked to the infrastructure somehow. They are linked to the greenery. They are linked to the sort of many climate issues. But I think it's sort of, they haven't lost their civic character either, that they try to sort of boost this civic character. Of course, depending of the of the sort of what the square, how it's positioned in the city, and what functions it in the end is serving. But this is Israelplatz, which is next to the park, so they have made it actually very open space because the greenery is there, and it sort of stands over a big car park, so they have hidden the cars there, and which is happening all over the Europe, all over the world, actually at the moment. And here you can see it's designed from Kobe, and here you can see that it sort of gives some functions into it, but it's more like the playing in the middle, but it's open to very different ways of use. And as we're talking about Denmark and Copenhagen, we're talking about bicycles also, because there, I don't know if you know, but there are more bicycles in Denmark than there are cars. So it's a big issue also in there. Then there is a square, it's the Norreport station, also made for Kobe and GBA, and I think it's a sort of a traffic hub, but it's interesting how because it's the entrance also to many different types of traffic, but it's also interesting some details which are not so well seen, but they have sort of made a small dent for the bikes or lowered down, that they are not so prominent in the square. And then they have sort of made these nodes, these landmarks, these canopies in the square to sort of give protection, but also as a landmark in the area, like you can see here. And what is, I think, so prominent in Denmark is that it's everything here, the urban space, the urban qualities are done with a very sort of high quality execution. They're putting a lot of effort in these public squares. And this is from the big Superkielen, which is interesting also in its character because it's sort of not right in the city center, but it has a little bit more freedom in it. It's the old industrial side, which they have adapted in the different use, but they are not giving so much. Of course, you have the bicycle path here, which is always the most prominent thing in the Danish design, but it's also giving sort of freedom to different things to emerge. And here is another part of Superkielen. It's sort of giving hints and inspiring you to do things, but not really telling what to do in these modern squares. And here is one interesting, which is still on the way, is from Tredje Natur. It's interesting office. It combines landscape architecture and architecture. And Sankt Cléd's Platz, which is very much hooked into the climate because it's sort of situated in the climate quarter of the city, which they sort of labeled as the climate issue. And it's very much green, sort of an interface between the people and the climate and taking care of the runoff waters and so on. But also, as I said, that the detailing is very important. This is the Karin Krokfors, and this is even more hiding sort of the prominent bicycles underneath this kind of a cabinet. We create a space also for the people to take their interesting space to take their bikes. But it's, as I talk about scales, in these squares and these urban areas, there's a lot of effort put into the detailing also. But then if we go to place and the issue of place and place making, actually in the urban space, is about the sense of place. Again, referring to Kevin Lynch, but it's a sense of play is so much connected to the social space and placemaking, and it is sort of studying the relationship between people and space. It's connected to the identity of the place and the human scale, but also a self-organizing potential, the emergence, potential for unpredictable use. And it's interesting how this sort of, we are moving slowly to another paradigm, from functional to social. And when we think about social space, when we think about medieval spaces, they were mixed and self-organizing. Everything was done in the same space. Here's a good image from Bruegel from the 16th century. But it is this sort of anything can happen. They were not sort of like the modernism sort of divided the functions, that we are almost going back to some ways to this self-organizing potential of space. And this is, I think it's so interesting. A small example from self-organization is from where I live. Is this used to be just a path in a sort of a quite cultivated park near us, and there were a lot of people fishing because it was a bay area. But there was a car park, and now in the pandemic, it just boomed with these food vans. People were able to buy their food. And I think it has changed actually this totally self-organizing character of the place. It's changed, it recharged the place in a different way. And I think people are using it more and more. It's interesting to say what happens after the pandemic, but we'll see. But when we talk about the social base, the new idea of the social space was this flaneur, which is the French word. In the 19th century, this is the Guy Le Botte's painting from Paris. But it is also this flaneur, is this sort of walking without knowing where you're going, that you're just there to see people and also to be seen, that you don't have to be on your way always somewhere. And also there was a discussion in the sort of the turn of the at the end of the 19th century and turn of the 20th century, like this fellow feeling and sympathy, because there was, like in America, there was a lot of immigrants coming, and they realized, and actually Olmsted was quite a lot, a sort of a father of the landscape design, was sort of promoting that the urban space should promote fellow feeling and sympathy to each other, so we can that it doesn't sort of become as a sort of catastrophic in a way, because there's so many people in it, but we have these parks, we have this kind of a urban design that promotes this fellow feeling, this sociability of the societies. And maybe the most prominent figure of the modern understanding of urban sociability is Jane Jacobs, with her book The Death and Life of Great American Cities from 1961. And she had been writing also a long time in New York, but this book was changed the sort of the game to come for a long time. And it sort of originated from this battle between Robert Moses, the urban, who was promoting this New Deal urbanism and this kind of a modernist way of effective design, and it became the battle for the city. And actually, when we think about what's happening now, it can be very clearly said that Jane Jacobs won that battle. And this was just to show you some background. It was this the modernist issues like the air and movement and these kind of things was so prominent that they were really going to change the whole area in Manhattan to something else, what it is today. And this really created an amazing counter-reaction, which was led by Jane Jacobs, because Jane Jacobs wanted to protect. She lived in a Greenwich Village, which was under threat. They were sort of demolishing buildings to have new modernist freestanding buildings on a site. And she was really afraid that the social aspects, the systemic issues, how people accidentally meet, how people go to their places, how they, quite in a democratic way, they can choose. They can choose where they go, and they sort of have their own preferences where they go and they meet about. And of course, it's it's the issue that New York is also very much known from today. And this is Oscar Newman's interesting image, how he sort of compares the high rise and the walk, to sort of this old urban area in the New York in the 1996. That actually it shows how this was about the values and about the worldview that created, because it's the same density. Nothing is really changing, of course. Of course, their ideas were also to give people good working buildings, but it sort of created other issues, which we are very much aware today. But here is this something about the book in a way, with a sort of a sentence from Jane Jacobs, from The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that it was an attack on the city planning. It was designed to make it as a game changer in urban. And after that, it could be said that sort of the understanding of the placemaking started to emerge in urban design discussion. And it's interesting because Jane Jacobs also made it, he sort of inspired the people to come along. It wasn't her fight only. People went along and they really understood that there is so much of their lifestyle in line in here. But there were others, and I think when we consider design, I mean, Jane Jacobs was a journalist, but when we think, consider design, I mean, there is William H. White and his Street Life project, where he sort of observed how people really moved and used space. And it was sort of trying to have a sort of a scientific, almost scientific approach, that what they are really doing there in that space. And it was also very important. I mean, he used film, that was the emergence of, in certain way, the moving image into urban design. But maybe the most prominent figure today is young Gale, a Danish architect, who started to talk about the importance of the social space in the 1970s. And he published his Livet mellem husene, which is the Danish, in Danish, the life between buildings, sort of putting the focus on the people and their lives in the urban space, 1971. And since then, actually, the agenda and the hasn't changed much, but it has been cultivated. And we just a couple of years, or was it last year, he published his Cities for People. And sort of young Gale went the same way, in a way. He was analyzing and designing that how do we do these spaces that people want to stay. It is in a way referring a little bit to the flaneur, but it's also that what makes them feel good. How are they empowered being in these spaces? And he has divided into a sort of the 12 quality criteria which you have to fulfill in urban design. And first is, of course, is this protection, what it has been. It's a protection against traffic and feeling safe. It's protection against crime and violence, feeling secure. It's a protection against unpleasant sensory experiences, wind, rain, cold, pollution, dust, and so on. And it sort of brings it with it very many issues into the design. But it's still a little bit a sort of a functional aspect of it. But it's also about comfort, opportunities to walk. Where do you walk with no obstacle, good surfaces, accessibility for everything, interesting facades. So squares are not just the 2D squares, but they are also the buildings around and how they are interfaces to the buildings, how the buildings react to the square and so on, or the urban space. But it's sort of these opportunities to sort of stay there, stand, look at it, and where to sort of sit, where is a good places to sit, where are the benches, opportunities to see things in a reasonable way, the scale, talk and listen, play and exercise, to do something what you choose to do. But it's also not just this protection and comfort, it's also delight. How do we have delight in the space? How do we feel the scale that they are designed to human scale? How do we enjoy the positive aspects of climate, that whatever weather we can sort of still accommodate us in the public space. But it's also like the sense of place in a way, that it's the positive sensory experiences. It's not just functioning movement, it's what we take. And I think that's the sort of also very much also connected to the meaning creation. And there he has this in his book, this sort of an extract from that book, an attractive public realm, what he calls the inviting streetscape, that we want to go there because it's so interesting and inviting, not that it's just a thoroughfare or some function. And then we are actually dealing with the details a lot. And here I think it's quite interesting image from the development on Times Square, which also shows how the function affects the form. The function that has been predominantly used by cars and the pedestrian going to the shopping or going to their errands, what they need to do in the city, to really define it as a public human scale square. And it's interesting because it was a sort of a trial for a year or two, and now it has been becoming a fixed, and actually it has had as an agenda, it has become the agenda of the whole New York. How do we give these spaces from traffic to the people to enjoy? And I think it's very interesting in a way, because here sort of culminates this discussion and fight between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in a very prominent way. Okay, thank you very much. And I was thinking if you have comments or if you have any questions, please, we'll leave a little bit time for those if you want to ask something or comment or what comes into your mind about the presentation.
Karin, first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. Introduce us to your perspective on how urban squares and urban spaces should be. So maybe, yeah, we should open up the floor for any questions. Feel free to raise the little hand icon in Teams if you have any questions. Maybe I have a question actually.
Okay, all right.
Just kind of thinking about, you mentioned about these at the sort of earlier on in the lecture, you brought up blueprints, which is something that any designers, planners need to prepare, to have a plan of strategy, especially for city, right? Something so big of a scale. But then with all the changes that goes on in our world, with new technology, it's important to be adaptive, as you mentioned. We need to think about placemaking. We need to think about how people move. But how do you believe cities should move forward because of all these issues and density and everything? How can we be adaptive and have the flexibility while having this kind of order and blueprint?
I think it's a very good question. Thank you. I purposely left out, in a way, the digital issues, because I thought that this sort of works as a background lecture for the workshop. But it is, when we are going further, the digitalization, the sort of the added augmented reality, all kinds of digital issues will emerge anyway in the part, but a part of how we are in the public and social media. And it's very much like, who will deal? Is it Google who sort of shows how we can do and go about and things in the city? But I think in the end, when we talk about it, is this human scale when we are inside of it. That doesn't really change. That doesn't change the civic squares that much, but its interpretation changes. How do we create it? How do we can sort of promote it, that people are not just doing what the designer think is appropriate for the place, but that they can sort of are inspired to do whatever they want to do. And I think that's the essence in the urban space, that how we can sort of recharge the space without defining exactly what it is. Of course, as we know, as designers, we have to think about it in advance and we have to be aware of it. But it's more like not to sort of try to sort of prevent something happening so much. And then I think the meaning creation and this kind of how we do the details, how we understanding in designers is so important and valid, because in the end the space is created by the design today. I don't know if I was able to ask you a question, but I mean, just propose another question if I wasn't.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have any questions?
Hello, Karin. This is
Hello.
a student here in HKDI, and my name is Steph. So nice talking to you, and thanks for the lecture today. And I was just been traveling around in actually many cities, and I felt so related to the part that you were talking about, how actually the churches have a great impact to the ancient or medieval cities in European cities. So actually, I think from my experience that there are just a lot of public squares that is actually located just right next to the major churches in many medieval cities. So I just kind of want to reflect my my thinking from your lecture, that I see those huge differences from lots of Asian cities and European cities regarding to the square design, because let's say I think in Hong Kong there are just no specific squares that that was designed in such a way that they open up in the church's area. So I just see many small squares that is next to the place where people live. So I think that the organization is very different from urban planning design kind of aspect, I believe. So I was just thinking, what do you think about the differences between the Asian cities squares and also maybe the Scandinavian squares or like the medieval squares? So what do you think about how maybe people react to that as well?
It's very interesting. Thank you. Very good question. I was actually thinking about it when I was doing the lecture, that how should I relate it to sort of the Eastern thinking of public space a little bit, but because of the site being in Helsinki in a sort of a European context, I took sort of deliberately this sort of European heritage of the square making, and I think it's a very I think you made a good notion in a way that you observation in that way, that it's they are very often related to churches, and then they originate from the medieval times, when actually church had a lot of power over the society, and it has been sort of the tug of war between the sort of the kings and the church and the sort of the rulers, but they sort of represent a different kind, maybe the world view, than if I understood, like in China, they are sort of the emperor is sort of more important, and it's sort of like they serve a little bit different aspects, like in the European squares. And I thought that it was so interesting thinking when I was in Kyoto, and there was in these old urban streets in Kyoto, that when we think about neighborhood, about the block of flats, we think about the block which is divided which is bordered by the streets. So that is the block of flats where sort of you get the communal aspects together. But in Kyoto, it's the other way around. It's the streets and the buildings bordering it. That is the sort of that's the neighborhood, the streets and its interface to the street. And I thought this is great. I mean, it's I thought that this is so interesting and different, that we see it actually more. My interpretation was that we see it more like still, and in a sort of from very sort of, even though it has the civic origin in Agora, we have learned to see it as a formal issue, when like in Kyoto, it's most likely it was about social issues. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other, I think, in that respect.
Okay, we have one question from Kevin Lee saying that my question, well, thank you for your inspiring sharing. My question relates to the Times Square in New York. When cars are closed off from the roads and pedestrian moved in, any organization takes over the administration of the road. That's the question.
Sorry, can you repeat? I heard a little bit the last part of the question.
Sure. So I guess the question was about asking whether there was any kind of organization systems that takes over the administration of the road because of the turnover from vehicular to pedestrian.
Yeah, I think it was I think in the end, it started as a sort of trial. They asked young girls to sort of think about what they can do from the city planning office, and it was so successful. But I think in the end, it is run in the end by the city planning office. But of course, there are so much different organization involved. Like when you think about New York High Line, which is this sort of the the sort of the rail track, elevated rail track in the city of New York, which was an initiative from the people, and the design was sort of ordered by some, if I know right, it was somehow initiated by the designers and these people who some kind of a group. But I think in the end, it's the city planning that sort of implements these issues. And I think the agenda has changed a lot in that, how they design the New York, as far as I know. Yeah. But I think that very important has been the initiative through the people, and which I think it's happening everywhere in a way, that how to take action in a way that how we should develop urban design and be more active towards it, particularly in Nordic countries. There are certain parks, like in city of Helsinki. 20 years ago, nobody really spent time there, sort of these cultivated city center parks, but now they're packed with people. They're really taking an initiative to be there and use it the way they want.
Okay, any other questions? I think the examples that you showed, especially the one from Kobe in Copenhagen, I think that's quite interesting. You know, the parks and the number of bikes being more than cars. You know, that kind of governs the social environment and the behavior, and then the plaza kind of changing. I think that's a really good example to illustrate that.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting in a way what they're doing in Denmark, and I think it starts to be the first countries where there are this sort of a shift happening to bikes from the cars. Of course, it's possible because it's a very flat country. Yeah. It's affected by that, but it's the part of their sort of the mental map of the city, also how they see city in a much slower pace. And I think that's one of the reasons why they sort of put so much effort into the details also.
Okay, I think if no more questions, then this wraps up the lecture. So thank you for Professor Krokfors for sharing your insightful view on cities and squares with us today. I think we really appreciate that, and it's once again very valuable for our guests and our students. So round of applause if you can clap from your office or your classroom or wherever. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
So for the HKDI Architecture Year 2 students, please remain online. And then everyone else, thank you for your time. We can have a quick discussion before our break, I guess.
Okay.
Sorry, Karin, maybe just give me 1 second and then I'll sort through the students. And then maybe we come back in 15 minutes, say, what time is it at your in Finland right now, in Helsinki?
It's 20 to 11. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we come back at maybe 10:55, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and then I'll round the students up, and then we can continue the workshop.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
See you then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank
Yep.
you.
Bye.唔該，其他同學同呢個 workshop 冇關嘅，唔該 log off 啦，即係尤其是 Year One 嘅同學。
Hi, Henry. I'm back here again. Can you hear me?
Hi, Karen.
Hello.
I'm in the studio with all the students, so give me another 5 minutes and I'll head back to my room. Oh, maybe 1 minute, and then.
Okay, great. No problem at all. Yeah.